the arguments and distinctions I'll be discussing today. So it all comes actually from, well, at least the first time I had exposure to the topics was when I read this book, The Way of a Pilgrim, in university, so in college. And in this short little book, there's this character who reads First Thessalonians. This is one of Paul's letters in the New Testament. And one of the verses there says, pray without ceasing, or pray constantly. And then the pilgrim thinks, how can I possibly do this? And he sort of goes on this, because, there's so many other duties and responsibilities that I have. How could I possibly pray and never stop praying, right? So there's surely other things will interrupt me and get in the way. And he goes on this quest to sort of discover how to do this. And actually the paper that or it's not a paper yet, it's more the presentation that we're going to go through. And so I'm going to start sharing my screen now. It actually explores a proposal about how to pray without ceasing that is in the Way of the Pilgrim. There's this little passage that I sort of try to get clear on how to make the most sense of it that we can. But first, I think I want to sort of make clear what the sort of issues are and what the problem is that we're trying to solve, and sort of why that matters. And so the problem that I'm going to call it the problem for praying without ceasing. And here's a way to put it, and I'll sort of explain how it works as we go. Okay, so the first, you can think of it as 4 steps that lead to a conclusion. So it's a kind of argument here. The first step is that 1 Thessalonians 5:17. So that's the verse that I mentioned that the pilgrim read, is an imperative telling us to pray without ceasing. Okay, the next idea is that, look, unless an imperative is incorrect, so if it's a correct imperative, we ought to do what it tells us to do. Okay, so I ought to do it. There's this thought that if we ought to do something, then we must be able to do it. So let me actually just underline that part of this statement here. So this right here is what's often called the ought implies can principle. So if I ought to do something, if it's really true that I ought to be praying without stopping, then surely I'm able to do that, right? Now I sort of expanded this principle, and I want to sort of tell you why I think the expanded version is more important here, or more relevant to this topic. So, and the brief thing is that I think I can show you actually that you can pray without ceasing if we just leave it as just mere kind of ability. So here's an example. So consider a nun who has memorized some prayers, and you can memorize some prayers too. They're not that difficult if you set aside, a day to memorize a few good prayers. And she prays these prayers, or she'll pray through a psalter, a prayer book, through her whole day. And now she has to do certain things where she has to put the book down, like, do the dishes or do some menial tasks or whatever it is that she has to do to manage her day. And then she sort of prays those memorized prayers. And she just keeps, and she's physically capable of doing this, and she does this until she gets tired and falls asleep, and then she wakes up, and then she does it again. And she does this day after day. Now, of course, there's a lot of things that have to be arranged for this to be possible, but it's physically possible. And the thought is that in some sense, that's physically possible for each of us as well. So we can pray without ceasing in that sense. I don't think this solves the problem for praying without ceasing, because the thought is that given our human limitations, if we were try to imitate this nun and pray like that, we would be unable to do many other things that we want to be doing and that we think we ought to be doing. Doing our jobs, being present with our family and with our friends and our children, or whatever, any sort of responsibilities we have. Not to speak of things that are just fun and you might think good and part of human flourishing to do, like, going to a theme park and having fun, whatever, right? So there's so many examples of things where you might think, because so if I was sort of had superhuman capabilities where I could be like praying like the nun is, and then on top of that, simultaneously doing 100% of what I normally do, then I think there's no reason to not be praying as well, right? So God commands us to do it, and it's good to be in communion with God. And so, right. But since I have these limitations and it seems like I can't do both at once, then I think there's all these really good reasons to not be praying at given times. If you have these competing obligations, like I need to teach a class or whatever, right? So I think really the principle that makes trouble for us here is that, if we ought to do something, we are able to do it. And it needs to be that there's no adequate reasons for us to do otherwise. And I actually mean something specific with adequate reason. So maybe I can say what an adequate reason is here. So I'm now explaining what this word here means. Okay. Okay, Varun. Yeah, sure.
Hey, a quick clarification. Can you
Yeah.
just, what do you have in mind when you say prayer as an activity? I mean, like, can you just
Great.
clarify that? Because, like, that
That's
is one thing that, I mean, the nun's example was helpful. Reading out some verses probably is one act of praying.
yeah.
Can there be other acts of praying? What all praying constitutes of, consists of?
Perfect. I think that to solve this problem, a big question is whether we need to say what prayer is. And in one of the papers that I sent for background reading, I discussed whether we need to give an account of prayer to solve the problem. I actually think that probably we do. And in the second paper that I gave my account of what prayer is. So in this presentation, I am going to assume an account of prayer. And I'll get to that, and it's in a couple sections to go. But the account is basically prayer is communicative activity oriented towards God, where that has two varieties. One is listening and one is speaking. So I'll explain that as we get to it. But the prayerful nun was speaking, maybe petitioning, making requests or whatever. Yeah, that's really important because yeah, I'll say more about that as we go. But yeah, that's a really important question. I mean, because if prayer is just anything, then it can be really easy to pray without ceasing, right? If for example, just breathing is praying, everyone breathes all the time, so then that's easy, right? So you need to have some account of what this thing is.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, so I need to be able to do this thing without there being adequate reasons for me to do otherwise. Here's what I mean by adequate. A reason R for one to do otherwise is adequate if and only if that reason R has enough weight that it is false that one ought to do the original activity A. So it's just any reason whatsoever where it's strong enough that it's just no longer the case that you ought to do that thing. Okay. So if there could be, you can give so many examples of this kind of thing. Suppose I think, oh, I'm hungry. I ought to go make myself lunch. But then my wife calls and says, oh, I can't pick up the kids from school and you got to leave now to get them in time. Well, now they've given me a reason that is makes it the case that it's no longer true that I ought to make myself lunch. I should, start heading to pick up my child. So that's a case of an adequate reason to do otherwise. And the thought is given our limitations, those adequate reasons to do otherwise are going to just pop up all over the place here. Reasons to do other than pray without ceasing. Okay. And here's the clincher here. We are not, in fact, able to pray without ceasing without there being adequate reasons to do otherwise. And in this talk, what I want to do is I want to explore a way to reject this premise and suggest that really we can actually do this. And it's a way suggested by the Way of a Pilgrim. There's this passage that I'm going to try to illuminate. What's the motivation for 4? Okay, so I've already sort of suggested it, but here's a way to sort of summarize it. Why is 4 plausible that we're not able to do this? We appear to have significant limitations when it comes to our ability to pray while also doing other things. That's the first thing. And second, many of those other things appear to be things we ought to be doing, we should be doing. Okay, so that's sort of the problem. And we'll see how we can head towards a solution for it. All right, so here's I am going to assume an account of what prayer is. So this is sort of segueing very naturally from Varun's question there. And here it is. One is praying to God at a time t, if and only if one is engaged in a communicative activity directed toward God at t. Now, this account is not meant to be an account of what prayer is sort of in English, what the word prayer means in English, or what prayer means like in all the religions of the world or anything like that. In the paper where I give this account, it's really meant to refer to what the Greek word that Paul uses here. So this is the English translation of something that's close to like proseuxte adieleptos. So, but the verb is like proseukomai. So that Greek word, I argue, in the New Testament, it seems to refer to communication or communicative activity that's oriented towards God. So I think that's okay to have that account. Let's try to solve the problem for that verse. So the problem here ends up being that this verse is incorrect, and you might worry, why is that so important if there's one incorrect verse? Just to make this a little more like, why does this matter for us? Like, I don't think that's actually super a big deal, but I think what the pilgrim is after is understanding of how to do this thing that they find really valuable. So they find really inspiring this verse. They think it's really valuable, and I think just one thing you can say to say why this would be so valuable to pray without ceasing is Christians often think of like the best thing for humans is to be in communion with God, and that maybe praying with God is something like communing with God. You know, it's you're in this sort of relationship with God, and if that's the best possible thing, why not try to do it as much as possible? Why not? How much of the best possible thing can we get? That's sort of one of the ways of thinking about it. So if we can shed, to the degree that we can shed light on how much we can pray and whether we can pray without ceasing, I think we might be shedding light on like, I don't know, one way, like human possibilities. Like, can we actually be in constant communion with God? And there are themes in scriptures that are like this. So like Enoch, an Old Testament patriarch, it says that God took him, he didn't die, he just was taken up into heaven because he walked with God and he pleased God. So he walked with God, he was in this communion with God. So that's, I think, some of the more deeper motivation for why to think about this issue, not just, oh, there's this one verse that maybe we need to show how it can be correct. No, instead it's like we're seeking understanding that can help us maybe achieve the thing that's like best for us, you know, communion with God. So yeah, so just a little bit of that. Okay, so when I say communicative activity, a communicative activity, I'm going to think of that as either speaking to a person or listening to them or for them, right? So if you're doing either of those two things directed towards a specific person, then you're engaged in a communicative activity with them. When I say listening to them, I don't mean that you actually have to be hearing something from them at the time. They might not be speaking, but in some sense, you're sort of, and actually I want to cash out what the sense is. You are making space in your consciousness for them at the time in some way. That's sort of a rough control, but I'll try to make that clearer. But yeah, so speaking is sending messages. Listening is orienting oneself to receiving messages from them. Okay, so given this account of prayer, then premise 4, we can actually cash it out. So it's saying we're not able to specifically engage in communicative activity directed toward God without ceasing, without there being adequate reasons to do otherwise. If that's true, it's also true that we're not able to do that in the form of speaking, and we're not able to do that in the form of listening. And actually, what I want to suggest in this paper is perhaps we have reason to deny 4A. L, what I've labeled it here. This says we're not able to listen for God without ceasing, without there being adequate reasons to otherwise. And I want to suggest maybe we can. Maybe we can listen for God without ceasing, without there being adequate reasons to do otherwise. And the way to see that, as we'll see, is to focus on the periphery of consciousness. Okay? All right. So here's the strategy from the Way of the Pilgrim. So this is, I think when I first read it, I'm not sure how carefully I read it, but then 2 years ago, I read it really carefully. And there's this beautiful passage at the very end that I'm going to quote and we'll think about together here. Okay, so here's the passage. Imagine that a king commanded you to write an essay on some difficult subject in his very presence at the feet of his throne. Now, no matter how completely engrossed you would be in your assignment, so you really got to imagine yourself there. You're like in a throne room or something. You're sitting there and there's this king and you're supposed to be writing something. You know, we're all academics. We know what that would, but there you are. You're 10 feet away from a king or whatever. No matter how completely engrossed you would be in your assignment, the presence of the king would not allow you to forget even for a moment that you are not working alone. Okay, so you wouldn't be able to forget that he's there right next to you, right? Maybe looking over your shoulder, okay? This very real awareness of the presence of the king clearly illustrates the possibility of praying even while one is engaged in mental work. So there's a monk that's giving this argument and saying why you can pray even while doing really difficult mental work, because the worry is, look, I can't do this while, you know, I might have to give an argument in a law court or do something that's extremely mentally taxing. How could I possibly do this while praying? And the suggestion here is like, look, this is a case where this person is using their mental capacities to the utmost, and they still have this sort of peripheral awareness of the king that's near them. And I think there's a suggestion here that similarly, maybe in our periphery, we can have that kind of awareness of God, and somehow that's going to constitute praying. There's a couple of things I want to point out about this passage and the strategy that's sort of at play here. One is that the passage is asking the reader to reflect on their experience, what their experience is like, by putting themselves in this imagined scenario. So I think they're assuming that whatever prayer is, it's something that has a sort of what its likeness or phenomenology, right? It's something you could notice in your experience. Otherwise, I don't think they would be giving an example of this kind, or they wouldn't feel the pressure to give an example of this kind. For example, if praying was like an entirely dispositional state, sort of like say the enduring belief that 2 + 2 = 4. You can have that belief without there being anything in particular it's like for you at the time, right? Because it's just entirely dispositional. But it's still true that you hold that belief. And if praying to God was like that, I mean, we wouldn't have to give this sort of fancy example where we can notice in our experience some change in what it's like that is going to correspond to praying. So I think that the assumption here is that prayer has a phenomenology, and I'm going to endorse that and adopt that assumption too, that the Way of the Pilgrim has here. So I'd label that phenomenology. There is something is like for one to be praying to God at time t. So praying to God makes a difference to one's phenomenal consciousness at t. So this puts a constraint on trying to explain how you can pray without ceasing. That every single time where you're praying, there's going to be some sort of difference. Now, it may be a subtle difference. So the difference that's pointed out in this passage focuses on the periphery of consciousness. So we need to be really careful and like do our phenomenology as well as we can and be aware of what are the different sort of peripheral aspects of consciousness that could possibly do the job here and could help us out. Another feature of this is that the person is working on the essay and it doesn't seem like they are speaking to the king. Instead, they have this kind of, let's see, let me or maybe make bold the phrase, very real awareness of the presence of the king. So that I think is one of the crucial phrases there. Very real awareness of the presence. It's, if anything, that seems most similar to listening or a kind of awareness of the king that, you know, might constitute listening for the king or being aware, like you might hear the king's voice. I don't know, something like it seems more similar to that than speaking to the king. So I think the strategy here is what I'm going to call peripheral listening. Here's the suggestion. We are able to listen for God without ceasing in the periphery of our, and now clarified there, phenomenal consciousness, without there being adequate reasons to do otherwise. So what I'm going to explore is, can we make good on this suggestion that peripheral listening is true, which is the rejection of, it's going to imply that premise 4 is false of the problem. Okay. A couple things to sort of evaluate this. One is, what do we mean by listening in the first place? Okay. And the other is, when we're talking about the periphery, what do we mean? So I'm going to first start with listening. Okay, what do we mean by listening? And I'm just going to give an account. I guess I'm going to give this sort of flat-footedly and just illustrate why I think it's motivated. But I'm not going to engage with like competing accounts. I don't know. I just think it's pretty good account. Sorry. And I got to keep going as well. But okay, here's my account of listening. One is listening for another person, if and only if. One is making it the case that the other is an object of one's consciousness in a manner which makes one better positioned to hear or understand them should they speak. So that's what I think listening is. At least at a first approximation. So this is something you're doing. You're making it the case. And you're going to actually be better positioned if you're listening. Why think that whatever listening is makes you better positioned? Well, suppose there's a student who somehow thinks that the way to listen to you as you teach them is to scroll through social media feeds or whatever, those little short video vines or whatever they're called. Okay. And they're just confused. They maybe think that they're listening to you or something, but because their position to hear you is actually decreased, they're not listening to you. Okay, so listening actually needs to improve their position, their ability to hear and understand you. Okay. Okay, so there needs to be something true of the person where there's an improvement in their ability to hear or understand. Now, this thing can't be something that's just happening to the person. So suppose there's somebody across the street and they have a bullhorn. The fact that they have a bullhorn does make it so that I'm more likely to hear them should they speak because they're louder, right? But that's not something I'm doing. So the improvement needs to be coming from my end. Okay, so I need to be doing something that improves my ability to hear or understand the person. Okay. Now here's a case I want to I gotta explain the case here for the Carol and Debbie stuff here. Suppose that there's a work van that's coming by and there's only one seat left, and you notice that the seat that's left is next to Debbie. And Debbie, you don't want to sit next to Debbie because she just drones on with these boring stories. And so you even consider, can I get a taxi before the work van comes? But then you think, oh no, I don't have enough money. I'm not going to pay rent if I, okay, so you choose to get into the work van. Now, choosing to get into the work van and drive, get driven to your college or whatever it is, work, it does place you in a better position to hear Debbie because you're sitting physically, 2 feet away from her. But this is not, supposing that you don't want to listen to Debbie at all, and you're like shifting your attention away, you're trying to read a book, you're not listening to Debbie, okay? Because there's nothing that you're doing to make her an object of consciousness. So you need to be doing this thing to make Debbie an object of consciousness, okay? All right, now, so it's not just any way of making the person an object of consciousness that's going to count as listening to them. So suppose Carol really doesn't want to hear Debbie's stories and like doesn't want to even think of what she's saying, but she finds it impossible to avoid, the social nicety of turning and looking at her as she keeps blabbering on or whatever, right? Okay. So, but suppose what Carol does is she decides to start counting the freckles on Debbie's face. Oh, there's 13 14, 15. Okay, so it appears that she's being really attentive, but actually her mind is completely else. It's on freckles or whatever, right? So this is a way of treating Debbie where she's not really listening to Debbie, okay? So this doesn't really tell us what it is to make someone an object of consciousness in the relevant way, but I think something like this way is discussed by Martin Buber in I and Thou and those sorts of things. And there's just this notion of second personal consciousness. You're like consciousness of the person as a you that like is that you can address and that they can address you. So there's a sort of second personal relationship there. So that's the sort of consciousness that I think you need to have to be improving your position in the relevant way and listening for the person. Okay, so so this is just a kind of consolidation of that. Okay, so that's listening. I mean, has some substance to it. Okay, so the question is, well, can something that with that kind of substance, can that be in our periphery? So that's now the question a little bit more clarified. Okay, so I'm going to move on to thinking about the periphery, and see what. Yeah. Okay. So the main point I want to bring out with some examples here is that the periphery has two parts. And the distinctions that I'm going to sort of be drawing here, it's not really coming from me. It's originally from a philosopher named Aron Gurwitsch. And I first learned of it from a philosopher named Sven Arvidson. But I'm going to give you some examples to sort of highlight it, okay? So consider a morning walk, okay? Here's just a case. On my morning walk in the woods, I am struck by and focus on a pink cherry tree in full bloom. Beautiful, pink, stark, oh, beautiful. It is dwarfed by the trees surrounding it, but their more ordinary green shades only accentuate its striking color. Also, I am wearing wool socks under my hiking boots, and though I have been awake for a few hours, I have not yet eaten breakfast. Okay, so the focus or the center of the experience here is the pink cherry tree. Okay, that's a sort of focal object. You're focused on that. Okay, but there are things that are you kind of experience as the immediate backdrop and as relevant to that tree. And so I'm going to call this the context. And I'll give some definitions that sort of clarify exactly what this means as we go on. But the context here would be, see these trees surrounding it, and there's more ordinary green trees. Okay, so they're larger green trees. Okay, these are part of the context for the pink cherry tree. They impact how the cherry tree is experienced. It's experienced as kind of small, right? I mean, if it was the only tree there, or if it was surrounded by short shrubs, you might experience the cherry tree as kind of tall, right? You know, so, but as it's dwarfed by these larger, it's experienced as smaller, because, and also its pink shade is sort of popping more to you because it's surrounded by these green shades. So this context is sort of experiencing, it's sort of, it's influencing and impacting how you experience that central object. It affects how it appears to you. Okay. Now, not everything that's in your periphery. So the center. So in some sense, the center is the center, and then everything else is in some sense peripheral, right? You might think. Okay, but we've already said that now the context is part of that, and that's stuff that is experienced as relevant to the center in a certain way that I tried to illustrate. Not everything is experienced as relevant to that center. So when I mentioned that you're wearing wool socks, okay, so you do have somewhere in the periphery of your consciousness a sort of mild sensation of the feel of the wool on your socks, on your feet, on your toes, right? And you also, you know, suppose you haven't eaten breakfast for a while, you're going to have some sort of mild feelings of hunger, maybe. You might not notice these, you might not even be able to self-report them, but they might still be aspects of your total experience. These aspects of your total experience, you're not experiencing them as in any way relevant to the central object of your attention. All you can say is that they're occurring at the same time. They're occurring at the same time, but beyond that, there's really no sort of relationship between the pink cherry tree and your feeling of hunger or the sensation of wool on your left pinky toe or whatever, right? Okay, so those I'm going to call in the margin. Okay, so they're not, sensation wool on left pinky toe. Okay, and these are what? These are not experienced as relevant to the center. Okay. Now this is a case, the morning walk. This has to do with sort of perceptual experience, and I have other cases that show that this is a very general kind of distinction. It crosses a lot of different kinds of experiences. But before going through those different cases, if necessary, I want to so the really important, crucial notion here is experience as relevant. That's the thing that distinguishes the context from the margin. And this distinction between context and margin is going to drive the rest of the presentation. So here's what I mean by the experience of relevance. For objects O1 and O2, O1 is experienced as relevant to O2 if and only if. O1 is experienced as pointing to or having something to do with O2 by virtue of what O1 and O2 are. I think this holds for the tree. Okay, so the large green trees are experienced as relevant to the cherry tree because their experience is pointing to or having something to do with the cherry tree by virtue of what they are and what the cherry tree are. So they're nearby trees. They refer to the tree by being somehow perceptibly comparable to it. Okay, it's by virtue of what they are that they have this sort of relationship. Okay. Because they have this sort of pointing or having something to do with sort of thing going on. I think Gurwitsch would call this reference. It's a very different, it was a translation from, I think, German. So he translated his field of consciousness from German, I think German, into English. And then this having to do with thing, I think he was using the word reference. Very different, I think, from what linguists and philosophy of language people mean when they talk about reference. But it's, I think, maybe somehow similar. In any case, so there's this sort of referentiality, or there's this having to do with, and then by virtue of that, there's this impact in how the object appears. Okay, and then a final thing is that by virtue of this impact in how the center appears, it's going to be true that a transition from one object as center to the other as center would be experienced as smooth or continuous. So what this means is that suppose I'm focused on that pink cherry tree. If I were now to be like, oh, let me focus on that big dark green, cypress or whatever, it would not be like this large interruption in your experience. Rather, it would be a nice kind of smooth flow to, oh, okay, now I'm looking at something that's related. It's like there's a sequence to it, and it's not a break in your experience. It's not a big transition. It's easy for it to happen. It's easy for you to focus first on the pink cherry tree and then on some other tree that was in its context, right? So you can be moving from that center to those contextual objects and back and forth, and that's all very fluid and nice, okay? Your experience is in a way sort of guiding your attention to these different things, okay? All right, so that is the distinction. So if something is doing that and has those three features, then it's in the context. If it's experienced as relevant in that way, otherwise it's going to be in the margin. Okay, and this is a very general sort of distinction between the center, the context, and the margin. So it can also hold with sort of if you're engaged in activities. So here's a case. I'm wondering if I should do these three cases or these two other cases, given how much time is passing. I can go back to these cases if you want to, maybe. I think Yeah, I think that probably this distinction between context as margin is clear enough to go on. But if you have questions about whether this distinction really holds in other domains, then I can go back and discuss some more cases if you want to. Okay, so I think I'm gonna push forward. So as I had said, Gurwitsch is the origin of this. If you read his work, you'll see the word theme as the center, and then thematic field as the sort of context, and then the margin as the margin. But I'm calling it center, context, and margin. Okay, so that's the distinction there. Okay, so what we've learned is that the periphery actually has two parts. There's the sort of context, the stuff that's experienced is relevant to the center, and then there is the margin. Okay, so what do we mean when we're thinking about peripheral listening? Does that mean listening to God in the context or in the margin? And there's a dilemma. The thought is that either way we try to do it, it's not going to work. So here's the dilemma. I'll just read out the dilemma and explain it as needed here. So statement 6, one is listening for God in the periphery of consciousness only if, and this just comes from the definition of listening, one is making it the case that God is an object in the periphery of consciousness in a manner which makes one better positioned to hear or understand him should he speak. Okay, so you'd be making it the case that God is an object of consciousness in the periphery of consciousness in particular, in such a way that you're better positioned to hear him should he speak or understand should they speak. Okay, next premise. God is an object in the periphery of consciousness only if either God is in the context or God is in the margin. This is just true by definition. So he's either experienced as relevant to the center or he's not. If he's experienced as relevant, then he's in the context. If he's not, then he's in the margin. Okay. And here's the problem, purportedly. We are not able to make it the case that God is in the context without ceasing, without there being adequate reasons to do otherwise. And so I'll explain why there's reason to think that premise 8 is true. Okay. Next premise. It is not possible to make it the case that God is in the margin in a manner which makes one better positioned to hear or understand him should he speak. Okay. So with 8, the idea is if you make God part of the context, this is going to improve your position to hear and understand him. The problem is this is going to raise the problem for praying without ceasing again. So it's going to be like, you're going to have adequate reasons to stop doing this because this is very mentally, it takes a lot of mental resources to keep something in the context. Okay, so let me sort of explain that motivation. Okay. The basic idea is there are cases where we need or ought to give our minds fully to a task. So keeping something in the context. So the context is a pretty limited mental resource. I mean, different people give different accounts of what the context is. I think Sven Arvidson connected the context with working memory as he was thinking about it. But in any case, working memory is limited, very, very much limited. So if I am trying to keep God in the context, well, that's going to limit what other things I can have in that context. Let me give you a case. Suppose you're a surgeon and you need to do a very intensive 5-hour surgery on someone that, might save their life if you do it properly, or kill them or let them die if you don't do it properly. Okay, you might need to just fully give your mind to this task, right? So you can't be doing anything else, right? And so that means that your context, so your center is going to be maybe your hand and the knife and like the next move, but the context is going to be other experiences having done this surgery, certain theories, certain sort of choice points, lots of different things that are going to be relevant to guiding your choices as you do this complicated surgery. Okay, so you need all of those resources like to the max. Okay, the thought is like that's an adequate reason to not try to maintain God in that context. Okay, because it's just not going to be possible to do so. Okay. So that's the reason to think that 8 is true. It's just too taxing. We're not able to do it in certain high stakes scenarios where we need all of our mind, as it were. Now, the same worry doesn't really hold with God being in the margin, because the margin doesn't have the same, like, suppose you're the surgeon, right? And so whether the sensation in your left foot is one of a wool sock or instead some other kind of sock, that's not going to tax your surgery. So if God's in the margin, in some sense, it seems like, well, that could just, float along with everything else that you're doing, because it doesn't seem to burden your cognitive resources in the same way. It seems like you can just put whatever you can imagine in the context. Okay, maybe there's a background hum of a AC unit. Maybe there's not. That's not going to really burden the surgeon, as it's still part of his total conscious experience in some way, right? There's still some difference in what it's like to be them at the time, based on whether the AC is running or whether it's not, or whether they're wearing shoes or sandals or those sorts of things. It's just not the kind of thing, it seems, that would burden their cognitive resources at the very moment of execution that they need them. So then the thought is, okay, well, look, we can somehow have God in our margin. Now then the worry here, though, is that it's not going to be that it's sort of it doesn't really help. Like the point of listening is that it is going to improve your position. It's something you're doing that's going to improve your position to hear. And so there's two worries about it here. First is that it's unclear that placing something in the margin, or organizing something and having it be in the margin is even something we can do in the first place. Seems like the margin is like the zone of just where our will is not operative. Like what's there is just happens to be there. It sort of imposes upon us, right? Okay. So that's one worry. How, we got to make sense of organizing the consciousness and that being an activity as opposed to something that's just happening. Okay. Second, suppose we can solve that. Suppose there's some way to actively organize the margin. It does not seem that God being in the margin could make one better positioned to hear or understand him should he speak. And here's one way to see why this is a worry. Marginal items, based on what they are and what they do not impact how the center appears to one. So one way that something can get your attention is that it impacts the orientation or the appearance of the central object that you're focused on. So the context can do that. And that's why a shift from the center to the context is often very smooth and continuous, because the context has that power to do that. But the margin can't do that by definition. Oh, so there's this, maybe I do need to, maybe I can now. Okay, well, the case of philosophizing at home, the case is basically I have some sort of philosophical idea at the dinner table, and I'm like absorbed in it. And it turns out that I can't hear my daughter speaking to me for 30 seconds. And then she's kind of upset by the time I notice, because she had called my name 4 times or whatever. Let's not say that this is a real example. Maybe it was. Okay. But the thought here is that the idea is like the focus, and then there's like a penumbra of like related ideas. Oh, maybe I could write this paper or that, or do this other thing. And that's going to be the context. And then other sensations, including my daughter's voice, would be part of the margin. Now, my daughter's voice eventually did break through, right? So the question is, how did that work? The thought is that when marginal items break through, it seems like they do so just by virtue of how like repetitive or disruptive or loud they are, and not necessarily on what I'm doing, right? And here's another reason to worry about the thought that marginal activity can sort of constitute listening. Consider 2 cases. One is you're in a room where there is a AC unit that's humming, and then it turns off. Okay, so that's a change. And then you sort of notice, oh, there's something different. So in this case, you were marginally conscious of the AC unit, and then it stopped, and then you notice something different. Okay, so there's a noticing there. Here's another case. The AC unit is not on, so you're not marginally conscious of anything like that. And then it turns on dramatically because, maybe there's some something where there's a certain temperature and it turns on at that temperature or something, right? And then you notice, oh, there's something different. Oh, the AC turned on, right? Both of those cases involve you noticing something. But in only one of those cases are you marginally conscious of the certain thing, the AC unit. And the other, you're not marginally conscious of it at all. It just pops into your margin and then you notice it. And the thought is, these are so parallel that like it's really unclear how putting God in the margin is going to sort of improve matters when he can just pop into the margin and then get you to notice him that way. It's like it just makes it seem like what positive work is being done here by somehow trying to get God into the margin. Okay, in any case, all of these are reasons to sort of worry that, look, it's unclear what work the margin is going to do to get us to actually hear God's voice. And so how is that going to constitute listening? How is that going to constitute praying, given the account of prayer? And so how is that going to solve our problem? Okay, so that's all of the sort of worries about it. Okay, so what I want to do now is suggest that there's a response to this. So in particular, this last thing that I was trying to motivate, motivation for premise 9, that it is not possible to make it the case that God is in the margin in a manner which makes one better positioned to hear or understand him should he speak. I think there's actually reasons to reject that. So I was just trying to motivate it, but in the end, I think we should actually reject it, or at least I want to explore reasons to reject it, okay? And endorse instead that it is possible. It is indeed possible to make the case that God is in the margin, where this is actually going to help us and improve our chances of hearing God. And this is sort of just exploratory, and I've just thought of different kinds of possibilities and examples and stuff. So I'm curious what everybody else thinks. And this is actually heading towards sort of the end of the presentation itself. But the point here is, okay, how can we sort of explore how it really is possible for the margin to do this kind of work we hope it can do? Okay, here's a sort of analogy. So the first thing is like, yes, I do think we can arrange and do things that sort of promote or even somewhat make it the case that in our margin there are certain items. So for example, if you get up early in the morning and you listen to a really catchy song for an hour straight on repeat, then for a period of time in your morning, you're going to have that song just playing in the background of your mind, right? Okay, so that's in the margin, right? Okay, so we can get things sort of in our margin like that. That's possible. And another thing is, okay, well, the things that appear in the margin, we want them to have sort of some kind of uptake with us. So if we're thinking about maybe impressions, and the thought is, okay, if God is real and he's going to be speaking to me, then I want those impressions to consolidate as, oh, maybe that's God's voice, or I want to be able to recognize it as God's voice. Here's an analogy for that. So if you're walking around a nature reserve with trees and stuff, and you see these flicks go by in your periphery, you're not going to notice that that's a kingfisher and that's a whatever. I'm not a birder, but a birder would have a lot more examples. Kingfisher was the only word I can think of. What are some other birds? The point is someone who's a birder, someone who focuses on birds and like has a book about birds and sees birds and so on, then these things that appear in their periphery, they consolidate as meaningful units that they recognize, right? And I think the same thing follows if you think about, say, Alice. So the example of what I've called intensive morning prayer. Alice intensively and centrally prays to God for an hour in the morning. Because she does this, God is in her margin. So that's kind of like, okay, now the song is on repeat. So God is sort of there in the marginal periphery for significant periods. And then she's also kind of like that birder because she has this sort of experiential connection with God. And so then the impressions that are going to be there in the margin are more likely to have meaning and also to have salience. So salience is like how much it pops out in your experience, right? So you have the central object that you're focusing on, and then there's lots of things, say, in the margin, right? There's lots of sounds and so on. But suppose that there is a sound that is an alarm telling you that the oven needs to be turned off. Well, that sound, by contrast with, say, traffic honks out the window, is going to have more salience because of certain reasons, right? You're sort of, it has a certain role in your experience where it's telling you to do something. So similarly, the intensive prayer, this person is going to give more salience to those meaningful units that are going to pop out in their margin. Okay, so the thought is doing this is going to help get God in the margin in a way that's actually going to help us pray throughout time. Okay, and I have more cases like this. Here's another one. So something that Gurwitsch talks about with the margin is that he thinks that our marginal experience always includes marginal experience of some part of the surrounding environment and your own physical body. Okay, so I was thinking, okay, like what if we could build into our surrounding environment something that has this kind of reference to God? So, and this is a practice people do. People will hold rosaries or small crosses and things like this. People who maybe even are inspired by the way of a pilgrim, right? Even the pilgrim himself, he holds a little rosary, right? Okay, so maybe this is sort of justifying this practice here. So Betsy holds a small wooden cross in her hand throughout the day. The cross is very meaningful to her. Any experience of it, whether visual or tactual, and so she's holding it, so she has that tactual experience of it, has a kind of built-in reference to God and to her relationship with God. Because she does this, God is in her margin for significant periods. Impressions are more likely to consolidate as God's voice, and such experiences are more likely to be salient to her. Okay, so the thought is maybe that also could help us pray without ceasing. Here's another sort of, and this is something that happens in the Way of the Pilgrim as well, where they practice this breath prayer, Lord Jesus Christ, have mercy on me, on the in breath and on the inhale and the exhale, right? And they do that until that sort of subvocalized language is like on repeat mentally. And a way to think about it is kind of like built into their body. So part of their bodily awareness is this subvocalized sort of prayer, as it were. And I think this is a way, since you sort of have this marginal awareness of your body, if that's also building in reference to God, this could also do the work in the margin that I was talking about as well. So that's a way to think about the Jesus prayer. It's also something you're sort of doing. So here, this parallel of walking to a destination. Suppose you're walking somewhere, maybe with a friend, and you know the destination you're going to. You might be focused on something else. You might be focused on some interesting topic, and you're fully focused on that. And so your center and your context is all on that, right? But there's still something it's like to be walking to that particular destination with your friend. Your body is going in a certain direction. Your body hasn't forgotten it. And so the thought is similar. Could the way we sort of manage our bodies make it so that we have this sort of marginal awareness of God in a similar sense, you know? We build in this sort of that we're with God into our bodies. It's just a thought. Okay. Two more. This one, I won't read it out maybe. I'll just say that what she's doing is everything that she's doing, she sort of tells herself and she sort of conceives of it as something she's doing with God. And the thought is this is going to help her to hear God's voice when it happens in the margin, even though she's fully focused on the tasks. And I think that this is very similar to getting someone to think that they're actually in the scenario of the Way of the Pilgrim, where, you know, there's actually a throne room like behind you. And so you're doing your work and you're sort of aware that there's this king there. Well, it's trying to make that real in your experience. God, I'm really working with God. He's right here in this room, right? Here's an analogy that maybe could help as well. So you're reading a book that you really love and you're going to get engrossed in it. You think it's amazing. But suppose you're also in prison. And suppose that your cellmate across is also going to read the same book, right? And suppose you know Morse code. Now, random little taps or noises, you wouldn't really like cause you to listen to them, right? Suppose it's kind of a noisy prison or whatever. But you've learned to recognize the tap of your friend and the Morse code of your friend. So even while you're reading this book and you're fully engrossed in it, if you hear that particular kind of tap, you're going to pay attention to it. It's going to consolidate in the relevant way. Okay, and the reason why is because you conceive of yourself as somehow with this cellmate or this person who's on the other side of the wall. Okay, so the very same sense, tap, which might have you not have noticed at all, you might hear because you have built this sort of connection with that person, and it sort of matters to you. So even though while you're reading the book, you're fully engrossed, you're still able to sort of have these things pop out in the relevant way. The final case that I have here is someone, it's similar to holding the cross and where that cross has this meaningful reference to God, but instead the person has, as it were, changed their way of thinking so that they see everything as it really is, at least on Christian doctrine, as created by God, and so as itself something sustained by God's hand or whatever, and so it has that reference to God. And a way to think about this is that if you have a physicist who's just obsessed about physics, then whenever they look around and they experience, the trees or whatever, their mind is immediately thinking about electrons and so on, right? And so Evelyn, she's not thinking about electrons when she sees the trees, but the trees have this immediate reference to God and his sustaining power when she sees those. And so the thought is, if we really changed our way of seeing things so it's like that, then we would have God in our margin in a certain way as well. And maybe that's another way to do it. Okay, so all of these are motivations for thinking that maybe it really is possible to make God, to place God in the margin in a way that sort of increases our chances of hearing and understanding him. Now, something that I can't really discuss, or I don't plan to discuss in this presentation at all, is this link here. The thought is if it's possible to do this, then it's possible to do this without ceasing, without there being adequate reason to do otherwise. And I think that's actually a very substantive claim. Just because it is possible to do certain things that place God in the margin, and that can have sustain for a certain period of time, is it really possible that we should do this without ceasing, that there's no adequate reasons to do otherwise? I haven't been able to motivate that, but I have given sort of a suggestion. Well, like maybe the margin is not going to tax us too much. So the more that we can pack, sort of marginal awareness of God into our days, like what are we to lose, right? Because we still have the context in the center, which is all that we're really using when we sort of engage with full force using our minds to think about something. So the margin seems like free game. Why don't we just see how much of God we can fill it with, right? That's the thought. And I think that's the best I can at the moment. That's my best stab at making good on the strategy inspired by the way of the pilgrim in that analogy. And if it's true that the link is true, then we're going to have what I call here resolution. It is possible to do this, putting God in the margin in the relevant way, without ceasing, without there being adequate reasons to do otherwise. And that's going to imply that premise 4 is false of the original problem for praying without ceasing. Now, so that resolves the problem. Okay, I don't think of it just as a little dilemma, that philosophers are thinking about. I think of it as, oh, look, can we find understanding that can actually inform our religious practices? And this is something that, Eastern Orthodox take this really seriously. That's a branch of Christianity where praying without ceasing is sort of a really big deal. And there are different Christian groups that take it increasingly seriously. So I think exploring how to make that, vivid, how could it work, or whether it can work, I think is interesting. I'm also interested in everyone here in terms of if there are similarities between this issue and problem in sort of Christian theology and practice with similar religious practices maybe in other religions. I think there might be structurally similar issues, and I'd love to hear that. I also love to hear any questions or objections or anything that have come to mind throughout the presentation. Thank you so much for paying attention, and I'd love to sort of discuss anything that comes up.
Yeah, thank you so much, Michael. Stop the recording and